Welcome back. I'm in New York City today in Central Park, and we're going to talk about how it's a real challenge to read history because history doesn't really present both sides of what's happened historically. And I'm going to take as a case study the Muslim caliphates of history and their traditions of slavery. And before I begin, I just want to point out what an amazing place Central Park is. It was created and designed by Olmsted, an architect, a landscape architect, in the 1860s. And that was many years before the Income Tax Act of 1913. So for people who tell you you need government to create public goods, this is an example of how that is not the case. It's 83 acres, one of the largest parks in the world in a major city. That rock you see behind me is kind of interesting. These rocks are from the Precambrian age, which is before the Ice Age. So there's a lot of those things, and I think that's an interesting fact. So the problem with history, you have the banal statement that history is written by the winners, etc. But what that does not account for is that the descendants of those victors could have a more nuanced view just as a way to learn from history, right? But that's not the case always. And one example is the Muslim caliphates of history and their penchant for slavery, which was really a very fundamental part of their business model. So the caliphates, and if you read history, you see that the caliphate stretched all the way from Egypt all the way to very close to India. They had a large footprint. They had slavery for 1,400 years. And we know this because the Ottomans described it in excruciating detail. The Ottomans were great administrators, so they wrote down everything. They kept spreadsheets, basically. And so they document their history with slavery. And we constantly hear about the Atlantic slave trade and the West's interaction with slavery, which was part, unfortunately, of the business model of Britain and a lot of European countries for 400 years. The thing that strikes you is almost every civilization has had slaves. There were Nubian slaves, there were slaves, the Bible talks about slaves, let my people go. Just about the only place that didn't have slavery was India, although I'm sure there are other areas as well. So we have 400 years in the West, and we have slavery that's ended by the participants before they needed to end it, i.e. there was no war. And, you know, I'm not a big fan of Brits or their British history, as you can imagine. But they did a few things right. And one of the things they did right is they morally objected to slavery. And not only that, but they impressed slaves. That is to say, they got on ships with slaves that other countries had, and they freed the slaves, which is pretty impressive. Now, if you look at college courses in the U.S., and you look at the textbooks that these college courses have, I've done kind of a cursory view of that, and I found 3 instances of the mention of Muslim slavery. And I found hundreds of mentions of the Atlantic slave trade. In fact, we have an entire subject area called African American Studies that is basically focused on the slave experience and the post-slave experience. But I never have heard textbooks used in these subjects like African American Studies. It talks a lot about the Muslim slave owners who were around for 1,400 years. By the way, New York City is a very noisy city. I kind of like it because it demonstrates life, but you're going to hear a few noises like this ambulance that's going behind us. I hope somebody's okay. So, one thing with respect to slavery that always struck me very odd is that slavery and the analysis of the Atlantic trades tends to focus on the buyers and not the sellers, which is really odd to me. Like, you take the drug trade. In the U.S., if you are caught with enough drugs that it looks like you're going to sell it, you get a much more severe penalty than if you're caught with drugs that small quantities that looks like it's for personal use. So in other words, the sellers of drugs are penalized a lot more than the buyers of drugs. So why is it we never hear about the sellers of slaves in the Atlantic slave trade? After all, the sellers were black Africans and Arab slave traders. Places like Mauritania, they'd go deep into Africa, go into the villages, and round up people, take them to ports, and sell them to Westerners. Very few Europeans went into the deep hinterland to abduct slaves. It was blacks and Arabs. And the thing about Arabs is the blacks enslaved their own people, sometimes rival tribes. But the Arabs never sold Arabs. The Arabs sold other people and other religions. Blacks being the primary group. I mean, the blacks don't get a break, do they, in history? So that's really odd. If you're going to tell history, you've got to take both sides. You've got to say history has been around in just about every civilization. And the Muslim caliphates had slavery for 1,400 years. The Atlantic slave trade was around for 400 years. In fact, the Arab slave trade didn't end until Saudi Arabia banned it in 1962. I want you to imagine that. There were slaves being traded in 1961 in Saudi Arabia. In fact, Mauritania didn't prohibit slavery until 1981. But they didn't put it into legislation, whereas the Saudis did. How come we never hear that? That's really odd to me. And the answer is because there's such a thing as political ideology, and the political ideology seeps into the university system. It's no great insight to tell you that in universities all over the world, especially in the West, the cultural Marxists have taken over these institutions. And the cultural Marxist left point of view is that the West is about white supremacy, And the slave trade is an example of that white supremacy, and therefore Western civilization is bad. Now, I think there are bad elements in Western civilizations, and there are good elements. But instead of presenting that balanced view, there seems to be this bias, which I don't understand, right? That's just not an accurate view of Western civilization. So to go back to Britain, I went to Cambridge University as my first master's degree, and I faced a lot of racism. My tutor used to call me the colonial. He would never address me by my first name. So I've never faced racism like I faced it in England. And so I definitely have a bias against England. They obviously colonized India, where I was born. Not big fans. But having said that, you can also appreciate good things that civilization did. They gave the world the English language. They gave the world the common law. They gave the world the St. James Bible, if you're a Christian. In fact, Henry VIII was quite the baller in terms of, probably in more senses than one, in breaking from the church. And yet, they did a lot of things which in today's standards aren't good. But it serves no purpose to give a one-sided view of history. And it's more of a question than anything else. History cannot be told objectively, and people should stop trying. The closest you can get is to have the perspectives of both sides, but your access to both sides will be skewed. Therefore, you'll never get an objective perspective on history. It's the same thing with journalism. There's no such thing as objective journalism. Journalism reflects a hierarchy of values, and that hierarchy is a value judgment. And that bias is explained in sequencing. So if you have the evening news, you have to decide what news is first, what news is second. For example, right now, there's a famine going on in South Sudan with 1.5 million people. But what tends to come on the first part of the news is first Trump and second the war in the Middle East between Hamas and Israel. So why is it that 1.5 million people dying of starvation is less important than a much smaller conflict or what is perceived as the outrages that Trump did that day? It's not an objective field. History is not an objective field. So let me take a second example that goes outside the caliphate, and that's the Vietnam War. So I read the biography of Ho Chi Minh, who was the intellectual leader of the North. And I read the biography of Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, and Kennedy as well. They certainly started and stepped up the Vietnam War. And what was fascinating to me, and I find this fascinating when I visit Vietnam in my travels, is when I go to Hanoi, I want to find people who participated in the war for the North. And I talk to them. That's what I do. I go around the world. I do interviews. I talk to people, share them on my blog, share them on my vlog. And when you combine what Ho Chi Minh said with what people said, for them, their perspective was that they'd been dominated by foreigners for 1,000 years. First the Chinese, eventually the French, even certain empires from Cambodia. And so when America entered the war, they saw them as just another foreign colonizer. Now, why is that important? It's important for motivation. Think about what they were fighting for. They were fighting for their culture. What is culture? Culture is expression. It's your language. It's your religion. It's the legal system you follow. Different modes of expression. It's your art. It's your music. They were fighting for control over their culture. And when America joined the war, all of a sudden, it was not just a war of communism versus capitalism. It became a war of fighting for your people, your culture, your ancestors, the legacy your ancestors left you. And the problem in the South is you had Diem, who was a Catholic in a Buddhist country, who was brutal to the Buddhist monks, who was corrupt as heck. So if I'm a South Vietnamese guy, other than my paycheck, what am I fighting for, right? But when you read in the West about the Vietnam War, you don't understand this basic dynamic. You don't hear that they were fighting against colonialism from their point of view, and the South was fighting, I guess, for capitalism and individual liberties. But all these rocket scientists who were advising Johnson and Kennedy, they couldn't figure this out. If I was an advisor, you just need a historian to say, these people have been fighting foreigners for 1,000 years. If we enter, we will be yet another foreigner, and it will be a moral contest of foreigners versus us, of our culture versus somebody else's culture, and we cannot win because they will be more motivated than the people we support. Now, of course, hindsight is kind of gives you some advantages. But my question is, why do I not read that? Why do I have to go to Hanoi, talk to people who went in the war, and figure this out? It's because history is biased. So the message of today's video is, when you read history, you got to be really careful. You got to ask yourself, why do we almost never hear about the 1,400 years of slavery that the Muslim caliphates had? And by the way, the reason they got slaves primarily is they needed warriors. So they used to steal the young boys and train them. And some of them actually went back when they were men and attacked the village that they came from. So, you got to also ask, how were the caliphates successful in expanding so rapidly? And the answer is slaves. Slaves was a big part of their model. So think of the caliphates. Think about why you rarely hear about them. Think about North Vietnam. Why do you never get the basic point that they were fighting, or they thought, Ho Chi Minh thought, and you can see this in his writings and his speeches, he thought that he was fighting for the liberation of his people, defense of his culture, defense of his ancestry. Why do we never hear that? And the answer is because there is bias. And if I was a journalist, I would say, hey, here's my bias. I only got to talk to one side of the equation. If I'm a historian, I would say there's multiple perspectives. My sources are primarily on one side. Here's a brief summary of the other side, but I can't penetrate it deeply because I don't have sources there. That's what I'd say. Now, what has this got to do with anything? It has to do with clear thinking. If you're going to learn from your mistakes, if you're going to aim for early financial freedom in 20 years or less, you have to be in touch with reality, with truth. In my framework, truth is the highest value. Everything else comes second. And part of the reason is, if you're not truthful and you don't seek truth and you don't speak precisely and you don't speak the truth and write the truth and search for the truth, then you're not in touch with reality. And if you're not in touch with reality, you're not going to succeed at whatever your goal is. So with that, I'm going to leave you. Beautiful Central Park. Come check it out. An oasis in the middle of a busy city. Take care, and I'll see you soon.